The Lifestyle by S.P. Barzey. The flame shot up into the air, and I felt the heat on my back as I spun my head around to look at the glow overtake the stage. Then, I spun my head forward with a large smile as I placed the microphone slowly towards my lips. My eyes scanned over the crowd. I stood before them in high heels and tight black leather. I stood before them, a rock queen. "What am I?" I screamed into the black foam, and without wasting a moment, they screamed back, "A rock star!" I laughed and shouted back with every bit of force I had, "You're damn right, baby." And with that, the song started. The people screamed, and I owned the 80s once again. An hour later, I was relaxing in the dressing room. My wig was off, boots off, and the crowd was still going wild. I dropped back into the small black seat and just looked deep into the mirror. My eyes were red, maybe from the work or the drinks, or maybe from the drugs. Yet, I just smiled and leaned my head back. "You're a star, baby," I said softly. Then the door pushed open and my drummer came in, swinging a bottle of Jack around in her hand. "I got your boyfriend, doll," she said loudly, as I jumped out of the seat with my shirt just hanging off of me. I went to hug her, but the emotion of joy slowly died as a young man came in behind her. I stopped cold and pointed at him. "Who the hell is this, Robin?" I asked, causing Robin to turn her head to look at the young man who had pushed his way into the room. "No fucking idea," she said. The young man looked around the dressing room then, his eyes cast down on me. He was pale and skinny. He smiled and softly said, "This is where you come to relax." I rolled my eyes. Oh shit, he's a fucking fan. I sighed and dropped back into my seat. The young man, or boy, he looked like a boy, whatever he was smiling from ear to ear as he slowly started to walk around the room. His hands started to make their pale way towards my wig. I closed my eyes and shouted out, "Robin!" She ran towards the young man and grabbed his arm, shouting, "Get your dirty little hands away from her shit, kid." The boy spun around when he heard Robin's words. "I'm not a kid," he yelled. And Robin laughed as she said, "Right, you're a big kid now, staying up past 10. The laughing stopped as she took 2 steps closer to the door and pointed at it, leaning into the boy's face. "Beat it. We party with men, not babies." The boy's eyes were just fixed on Robin. They were staring at each other for what felt like forever. I just looked at them. Then I smirked, leaned forward in my seat as I said softly, "Kick him out or kiss him. You two are getting boring." The young man laughed a bit louder than the statement required. Then his pale face looked over at me. "You're funny. I like that," he said as he started to walk towards me. Robin was still standing there staring at the empty space where the boy once stood. I watched her, standing there still as a statue, and then I called out to her, "Robin!" She shook her head for a moment and looked back and forth, puzzled. "What the hell?" I saw her mouth it softly to herself, and then she looked at me and the unwelcomed guest. The boy sat down on the arm of the chair I was in and pulled out a big Ziploc bag from his suit jacket. "Now, as you can see, I'm no baby, ladies," he said, as my eyes went wide and just looked at the oversized green wonders that lived in his bag. "I came here to party," he said, looking down at me as I slowly looked at Robin. I raised my eyebrow and smiled as I said, "What do you say?" Robin was still standing there looking a bit lost. She looked over at us, then turned fully towards the young man and slowly said, "I can't stay. I got some things to handle, but you two have fun." I stood up and started to walk towards her, but she rushed out of the room. "Robin!" I screamed. It was the oddest I've ever seen her act, and I had seen her trip and balls more than once a week. I stood there looking at the closed door when I heard the soft, young voice from behind me say, "So, you want to party?" I turned towards him. He had a big smile on his face, slowly waving the Mary Jane around from side to side in his pale little hand. "Or what?" he said, and I crossed my arms over my chest, leaning on the door. "How old are you?" I asked. He took a few steps closer, smiling as he pulled on a joint, lighting it up. "Old enough," he said with a laugh. I slowly turned around and placed my hands on the door. I thought for a moment about how much trouble this could be, how odd this would look in the papers. But it was just a passing thought as I locked the door. I was a rock star. I didn't think about my future. My life was the here and now. Good enough for me, I said. Whatever he had was good because I was gone. I was hearing things, seeing things, creepy things. There was a lot of screaming, a lot of blood. I saw his creepy little smile, heard laughing. I remember hearing a lot of laughing. The next thing I know, I was in a bed with my clothes off. I sat up slowly and put my hand on my forehead. It was the worst hangover in my life. I looked under the sheet and sighed. Fuck. Where's my shit at? I said to myself. I looked around the large room and then looked down at the sheets. Where am I at? Oh, God. I shot up out of bed and wrapped the sheet around me. The thought of sleeping with that creepy little kid. No! Oh, God, Guy. The thought of sleeping with that creepy little guy started to freak me out. Oh, I'm going to jail. I robbed the cradle. I stole the whole damn nursery, I said as I felt my body start to heat up. I was panicking, and for good reason. I ran my fingers through my hair as I quickly started to run around the room looking for my things. I pulled open the closet, and there was only one thing in it, a long, black dress. I looked at it for a long moment, stood there, getting all my thoughts together, remembering all that I could. I closed my eyes and my jaw tightened as I slammed the door shut and screamed out, I am not going to jail! That little shit is! I ran to the door of the room and yanked on it, but it didn't move. My eyes went wide when I found it was locked from the outside. I pulled at it and started pounding on it. You little freak! Let me out! Kidnapping a rock star is a bad fucking idea! I kicked the door and screamed, Kidnapping me is a fucking bad idea! When I let the words out, the door swung open and a pale woman stood there looking at me. We don't speak like that in this house, young lady, she said softly to me. Her eyes were cold and locked on me, her hair gray and pinned up. I just slowly walked towards her, holding the sheet around my body as I said, I don't give a fuck, Grandma. Let me go before I call the cops. The old woman stepped aside with a smile as she said, Let you go. No one's holding you here, dear. She then turned and started walking out the doorway. I swear the things that boy brings home. Get your things on and get out of my home, dear, before I call the cops. She said her words so quickly and so coldly, as if I wasn't even a second thought to her. I started running after her. I came to this massive staircase and just stopped. I took in the wonders of the old house and my jaw dropped as I said, Holy shit. The woman spun around on her heels and folded her arms. If I have to tell you one more time, it will be the last, she said. I nodded and looked around. Where are my things? I asked, and she just turned around and continued walking. How should I know? They're your things, not mine, dear. Just as I was about to get smart with the bitch, that pale little freak popped out from around the corner. You're awake, he shouted as he started to run towards me. The old woman grabbed him by the neck and whispered something into his ear. The boy shook his head with a smile. She can't leave, Ma. She's mine. I saw the woman's eyes go wide, and then she looked at me. I took a few steps back and put my hand up like I was in court on trial for my life. I didn't do anything. I swear he told me he was 18. When I raised my hand, I could see 2 little marks on my wrist. I must have been super trash because they didn't start to hurt until I saw him. I rubbed my finger along them, looked up, and saw that old bat was just staring at me. So I started to drop to my knees and put my hands together, praying and begging at the same time. Please don't call the cops. I've got an album coming out, I said. The woman's eyes didn't leave me. She was staring a hole into my skin, and I could feel it even though my eyes were closed. Then she just softly said, Get her dressed and bring her into the kitchen. We have much to talk about. The old woman took off around the corner, and the creepy guy was just staring at me. I crossed my arms over my chest and gave him the meanest stink eye that I could come up with as I said, Where's my things, you little freak? He laughed and started walking up the steps towards me. I put your dress in the closet. You didn't see it, he said as he ran past me up the steps. He looked 15, but he acted like he was 5. I rolled my eyes and started running up after him. I saw that funeral dress. I want my jeans and tee back, I screamed. But when my foot hit the top step, he spun around and placed his hand on my cheek. I felt a chill run through my body. It was a cold feeling that just wouldn't leave. It was like my heart was pumping out ice with every beat. Our eyes were locked as he softly said, I burned them. I nodded my head, and he walked into the room. I blinked and shook. That little shit just pulled some Jedi mind crap on me. I rushed into the room to see him standing there with the dress. I think it will look lovely on you. Now quickly change. Mother doesn't like to be kept waiting. He said the words as he handed me the dress. I held it in my hands as I listened to him slowly walk towards the door, and then I spoke the words softly. How old are you? He laughed and looked over his shoulder. I don't know, something like 255 or 56 years old. The door slammed on his last word and I spun around. I was in a madhouse, and if you learn anything from being a rock star dealing with crazy fans, it's stars don't make it out of situations like this. I slowly came walking down the steps in my new black dress. It was loose and long, and I had to hold it up as I walked like some kind of southern belle. As I made my way to the steps, I could overhear talking and yelling. It was the mother and the son, but there was another voice speaking softly with a hint of sobbing in every other word. How could you? You know I wanted you to make me. I thought you loved me. The boy sighed loudly and let out, I don't see what the problem is. She's Summer Storm. The Summer Storm. The old woman came in next, saying loudly, the problem is she knows nothing about you or the lifestyle that we lead, and now you two are tied together. Sarah has been training to be your mate for her whole life, James. James came walking out with his hands on his head. What's done is done. I can't change it now, he said. Then this pretty young blonde came walking out into my line of sight with her arms crossed. Yes, you can, she said as she looked right up at me and said, you can let her fade. James just shook his head. She won't fade. That's just cruel, he said. Then Sarah's head spun around to look at him. And what do you call pulling her out into our life? What do you call casting me aside? She screamed. James walked up to her and put his hand on her cheek. I still love you, he said softly, and she slapped him. You love the blood. You let her fade and I'll believe you, she shouted out like a spoiled child who was just told to go to her room. I rolled my eyes and leaned on the handrail looking at them. Listen, I don't mean to cut short another episode of As the Crazy Turns, but can we get back to the whole me calling the cops and getting out of here talk? I mean, I feel like we left that on a cliffhanger. I said loudly as my words hit the air. The old woman came up behind me. I jumped and spun around to look at her. What the hell? I shouted. No one is calling anyone, and no one is fading, she screamed. She fixed her hair and walked past me and started speaking as she made her way down the steps. As sickening as this whole thing may be for us, it has happened and it can't be undone, and I refuse to let this woman fade for... I cut her words off and raised my hand as I said, what the fuck do you mean by fade? Sarah and the old woman both turned to look at James. You haven't told her? Sarah said, and then the mother ran up to James. She moved like lightning. One moment she was on the last step, and the next she was in front of him, and her hand slammed into his face, and he hit the floor. Sarah ran to his side and held him. Tell me you didn't. Tell me you didn't, James. How could you change her against her will? After all I've shown you? After all we've been through? The mother screamed as James placed his hand on his cheek and looked up at her, then over towards me. He slowly started to stand up with his arm around Sarah as he said, She can be like our family, like a sister, or... Sarah pulled away and quickly asked, or a lover? I started laughing as I said, lover? Me? And little bit over there? I laughed so much I had to sit down on the steps. Sarah rolled her eyes. You'll fall for him. You'll have years together. How could you not? She said. And I looked up through tear-filled eyes, trying to clear them away as I asked her, What the fuck are you talking about? The lightning-fast old woman ran over to me and grabbed me by the ear, and the next thing I know, I was 2 feet off the ground, just hanging by my ear in her hand. What did I tell you about talking like that in this house? She said. I started to panic and scream. James ran up to her and pulled her hand. Mother, stop. She's new. She doesn't know the rules, he said. And the old woman dropped me on the ground. New vampire or not, I will not have my house turned into some kind of red light, low-rent hut. She screamed the words right into James' face. I was panicking and in pain when she dropped me. I rubbed my ear and then I stopped cold for a moment as I replayed her words in my head. New what? I softly said the words to myself as I looked up at them, and they were all staring down at me. Vampire, James said. He got down on his knee and smiled. I turned you into a vampire, so now we can be together forever. He said it so sweetly, so honestly, that it felt like it was a statement of true love. It made it hard to take a swing at him, but I did it anyway. And like the lovesick puppy she was, Sarah was right there to break his fall. I stood quickly, and before I knew it, I was taken over by rage. I was on top of the boy, clawing at him like some kind of mad beast, pulling his hair, slamming his head into the floor, and then I stopped and looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked back at the steps that I was once standing on. How did I get here so fast? I thought. All the rage I had was overtaken by fear at that thought, and I just stood and backed away from him. Sarah's cold eyes just cast on me. She's no good for this house, Mrs. Saint. She has to go. Miss Saint looked down at her son, who was bleeding all over the floor, and then rolled her eyes and placed her hands on her hips. No matter what you two may think, you're still children. 256 years and 17 added together still does not beat me. I take no orders in my house, she said before casting her eyes over to look at me. Now get to your rooms. I must speak with the dirty-mouthed one alone. I was in tears by then, just staring at her. I couldn't help it. This was all so crazy. One moment, I'm on top of the world, and the next, I'm being told I'll have to sleep 6 feet under it, or wherever it is that they sleep. I guess it's in bed, since they have a house. I watched as the boy stood to his feet, his face healing. Only moments after standing, he was all better. All that was left was dry blood. Sarah looked over at me for a long moment, and then turned and started towards her room, stomping and swinging her arms wildly as James started up the steps. He got towards his mother and looked down as he said, "I'm sorry, Mama." She nodded and started down the steps and replied, "I know you are, but what's done is done. Now leave us be, I must talk to the girl." "Yes, Mama," said James as he took one final look at me and then ran up the steps. I quickly used my hands to clear away the tears. I didn't want to look weak talking to her, but she knew I was broken. She just stood there looking at me. Then she slowly placed her hand on my cheek and with a soft voice said, "What has happened to you is something that no one should ever go through." She sighed as her hand fell down to her side. "My son has forced a choice on you that no human has to truly face," she said as she started to turn away from me. I looked down at her. I looked at her back and rested my head on the wall. "What's going to happen to me?" I asked, and she just stood there, looking at the front door for a moment, before she turned. I asked, and she just stood there, looking at the front door for a moment, then she turned to me. "The same thing that happened to me, dear. You're going to live your life one sinful day at a time." She said it with a smile, and as I shook my head, I walked towards her and replied, "As a vampire? I don't fucking..." I stopped and closed my eyes, sighing as I said, "Sorry, I don't want that. I never wanted that." She nodded and folded her arms. "Well, it's the choice that the world has handed to you. Live forever or fade away and die today," she said. My head hung low and I softly asked, "What do you mean by fade?" She took my hand into hers and started pulling me down the large hallway. I just followed, looking at all the photos on the wall. They started in color and then faded to black and white, then to a tan tint, then paintings. They were all of her and the boy. Never posing the same, but always them alone. We stopped in the living room, or the parlor, I guess. She seemed like the type to call it a parlor. She sat down in front of a tea set. "Tea?" she asked softly. I raised my eyebrow and shook my head. "I'm more of a Jack kind of girl, but thanks," I said. She smiled and poured herself a cup and then looked up at me. "When I was your age, I loved someone dearly. A young, beautiful man. So beautiful, he outshadowed me and many other women in rooms. I cared for him. I loved him. And one night, I went looking for him and he was gone, never to be seen again." She took a sip of her tea and softly continued, "Or so I thought, because when I was 63, laying in bed, slowly fading into death's arms, I saw that young man again. I thought it was a dream of an old dying woman. He leaned into me and kissed me softly, asking me if I would like to walk with him through the moonlight like I once did. I listened to her words and took a seat beside her. I leaned in and softly said, "What did you say?" She laughed at me and took a sip of her tea. "There was a young man who I loved asking me to walk with him. I said yes, dear, and he kissed me again, then leaned into my neck and She stopped and sighed as she rested her head back. I lived a long life. I watched all that I know change around me. I was ready to die, but he thought he knew better. I awoke the next morning to him hiding in a shadow-filled corner. He told me what he had done, and I cursed him. I cursed him loudly and coldly, she said. She looked over at me and leaned in. I didn't want this gift he had given me. I wanted him to take it back. He refused. He told me I would have to walk with him forever. He was lonely, and I would walk with him forever. I looked back at the hall with the photos and then at her. Where is he now? I asked. The old woman looked at me and smiled. He didn't do much walking after that morning. You can't walk with a stake through your chest. She looked at me with a smile. I guess she was waiting for a laugh, but she didn't get one. I could feel the pain push out of her with every word of the story. She had something taken from her. It was death, but it was her death, one that she was ready for. Then someone came and took everything she had away. She felt my pain just as I felt hers. We were like soulmates. Well, if she had one, and I guess if I still had one. We were like soulmates. Well, if she had one, and if I still did, I guess. This was all too crazy. I shook my head and said, So what about me? She nodded. I found out he forced blood into me as I slept, so I didn't have the choice you do, and I'm thankful for that. For you can feed and walk through the moonlight with us, or you can die painfully and fade into death's arms. My eyes went wide at her words, and I stood up and softly let out, This isn't fair. She nodded and sipped her tea, then looked over at me as she said softly, It was wrong of him to do what he's done, but there's nothing more we can do about the matter. You just have to come to terms with it and move on with your life. I dropped back into my seat and looked down at the floor. And if I don't want to? I said. The tone in the room changed when the words left my lips. She looked over at me once again and raised an eyebrow. She said, So you would choose death? I shook my head and sighed as I said, No, but life as a vampire doesn't sound any better. What is it you do, dear? She said. I looked over at her and smiled. You're joking, right? I said with a laugh. But she didn't laugh along. She just looked at me puzzled. I'm Summer Storm, I said softly. And she just shook her head. I sighed and stood up, running my fingers through my hair, trying to make it as big as my wig. I stood there with a smile. What am I? I yelled out, and she sipped her tea for a moment and then looked up at me. A confused vampire, she said. I couldn't help but laugh. She was right after all. I shook my head and said, No, doll. I scream, What am I? And the crowd screams, A rock star. It's my act, and then I break out into rock star lifestyle. It's my newest single. I looked down at her, and she still looked a bit confused. I just laughed and said, Don't you have MTV? She shook her head. I don't even have a TV, but James does. I sat back down and nodded. What's with him? That, I said. She rested back in her seat and softly said, What's with him? What's with him? I said. She rested back in her seat and softly replied, He was dying when I found him, the only soul I ever took. He was in so much pain, a victim of the war. I cut her off and said softly, That little young punk was in a war. She nodded and smiled. They signed up young back then. He was only 16 when he was turned. He's been around for years, but he still acts that age. I'm guessing that's how he deals with the matter. But I saved him, and when he returned home, they turned him. But I saved him, and when he returned home, they turned on him, called him a monster, a demon. So he came to me, and 2 lost souls made a home. I nodded for a moment, and then I pointed back at the long hallway. And that crazy little girlfriend of his? The old woman laughed. That's Sarah. Her mother worked for us, but she passed away. She took a liking to James, as did James to her. They were to be married, but after all this, I'm not sure if that will happen. I thought for a moment, and then I stood up. Oh, wait. So that little freak is getting married, and I was like, what? His last big bang before he gets locked down? The old woman stood up and sighed. It looks that way, she said. I walked past her down the hallway screaming, I'm gonna kill him! The woman laughed and shook her head. He's far too strong for that, dear. You're more or less still human. But that all can change. I turned around on my heels and pointed at her. You're, totally trying to sell this to me, aren't you? She nodded and walked up to me. She pushed my black short hair out of my face and softly said, You were murdered and robbed of your soul. Someone came into your life and made you a victim. You can fade away like the weak woman he thought you were, or you can walk through the moonlight like the strong woman I know you are. I just looked deep into her eyes and got lost in her words. She could sell salt to a slug. She smiled and walked past me as she started towards the steps. Stop playing the prey and start playing the hunter, dear. It makes life easier. I started down the hall and just listened as she walked up the steps. Nodding to myself, I thought, she's right. I was a victim. I was robbed of my life by a monster, and I was crying and playing right into that monster's hands. I've never played the victim before, and I had no plans of starting. As I thought this, a door opened and little Sarah was leaning in the doorway looking at me. Have you decided to fade yet? She said. I just rolled my eyes and mocked her childlike voice. No, I haven't decided to fade yet. She stepped out of the room and walked right up to me. She was staring me down, which, I had to give it to her, was a bold move given I was fast enough to snap her neck and get a cup of coffee before she hit the ground. Listen, Sarah. I sighed as I started to speak to her like a woman, like someone that cared about her poor little beating heart. I don't want James or this life, and you know what? If it were up to me, I'd hand it all over to you in a heartbeat, but I can't. Miss Saint's right. We all just need to move on from this. I don't want him. You two get married, and you can be turned to just forget this day ever fucking happened. She looked at me and smiled. I wish I could. I wish I could forget I ever saw your ugly little face, but I can't. You might not want him, but clearly he wants you. You'll fade, because there's not another living soul around here for miles, and I won't let you feed on me. So come to terms with death, for you'll be meeting him shortly. I looked at her as she started back towards her room. Bitch! I screamed out, and then she smiled and softly said, You're damn right, before slamming the door in my face. I just shook my head and started up the steps. She was right. Not that I wouldn't be able to feed off of her, but how could I? How could I take blood from someone, bite into their neck, and God, if I did, would she be turned? Would I have to kill her? I started up the steps to my room when I bumped into James and rolled my eyes. Can't you move from A to B in this house without running into someone? I said. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. I'm sorry. I truly am. I know all this must come as a shock to you. I looked at him for a moment and then leaned in. I want to rip your rib cage out and pick my teeth with your bones. I covered my mouth, and after the words left, he laughed. It's the hunger talking. I shook my head. That was me, I said softly. When you become a vampire, you're boosted, he said, and I just raised my eyebrow. I was a fun-loving, joyful teen, and as a vampire, I am more childlike than I'd like to admit. I folded my arms over my chest and softly let out, So, you're a 5-year-old on a sugar rush. He rolled his eyes. And you were already at the edge being a rock star, and now you're... I laughed as he couldn't come up with the word, and I said, Crazy? I pushed past him. I'm going to my room, I said. He smiled and looked up at me. Your room? Does that mean you decided to turn? I looked back at him. No. And then I started up the steps. I got to the top and softly said without looking at him, How would I, if I wanted to? Would I have to kill Sarah? His voice came out shocked, and he shook his head back and forth quickly. What? God, no! We have blood from the blood banks. A cup of that, and you'll be one of us. I nodded and turned around to face him. You love her, don't you? He smiled and nodded, and then I said, So why do this to me? He looked down and replied, She wanted me to turn her, and I didn't know if I could. What if I did it wrong? What if she died? I nodded and smiled. So fuck if I die, right? He shook his head and began to walk up to me as he started to say, It's more to it than... I cut him off with a laugh and walked into my room, slamming the door. I stood there looking at the large bed. This was it, my final hours. I went from queen to victim in a night. I walked over to the bed and dropped down on it, just resting my head in the silk sheets. I could turn. It would make for a whole new fan base, I guess. I sat up and laughed. What am I? And then I shook my head. A vampire, I said. I heard a knock on the door as I stood up and sighed before pulling it open. James, I looked around and no one was there I looked around and no one was there. When I looked down, There was a bottle of Jack with a note tied to it. I picked it up and looked at the note with a smile. Prey or hunter, just think about it. I closed the door and slowly opened up the bottle. She doesn't give up. The words came out in the air and then it hit me. She doesn't give up. She could have ended it all many times over the years, but she kept going. So why should I just throw it in? I sat on my bed with the bottle for what seemed like hours. Then I walked down to the room and stood at the top of the steps. I've decided, I screamed out. I looked around and sighed. Everyone and their mama was hanging around before, and now, no one. Miss Saint laughed at my words as she walked towards the steps. And what have you decided, dear? I looked down at her and smiled. I'm the hunter, not the prey. James came up behind her and nodded. That's great. We'll get you a glass. Sarah, he called. He called out to the young girl who was just slowly walking towards the steps. What? She said. Miss Saint looked at her. Get Summer a glass of blood, and don't be rude. Sarah looked up at me coldly and then smiled. Fine, she said as she walked off. Bring it to the bathroom. I'm going to take a bath, I said as I walked off. I pulled open the bathroom door and started to take off the black dress, standing in the cool white room and letting it all wash over me. I was going to walk in the moonlight forever. Was I ready for it? There was a knock at the door. I opened it and looked at Sarah as she just looked away from my naked body. Come in and put it in the sink. I closed the door as she made her way into the bathroom. James smiled, looking at his mother. You're gonna love her, Mama. When Sarah and I leave, Miss Saint looked over at James. Leave? Just where is it you two think you're going? James sighed and turned his back on his mother. When we get married, I very well can't live with you, Mama. That's why I got you Summer. The old woman pulled him around. You got her from me? You did this for me? James smiled and nodded. You took her soul, James. The young boy grinned and nodded as he said, and now she's all yours. Miss Saint went to slap the boy, but then a blood-chilling scream was heard from upstairs. Their eyes shot to the top of the steps, and before they could blink, they rushed to the bathroom. James pushed open the door, and there I was in the newly blood-red bathtub. Sarah's body hung over the edge of the tub, and the cup sat there on the sink. What did you do? My head turned towards them, and I smiled as I started to get out of the tub. The blood covered my whole body and made nice little footprints as I walked along what was left of the white floor. What do you mean? I said. James screamed out, You killed her! He ran to Sarah's side and took her in his arms. You were only to drink the blood! And I laughed as I responded. Sweetie, 1 cup isn't enough. I've been all over the world. I've set fire to stages. I've broken hearts and torn through men. I pulled the robe off the hook and started to put it on as I spoke. I walk, and the ground shakes. I smiled, turning towards Miss Saint, and placing my bloody hand on her cheek as I started to walk out. I'm a rock star. Overdoing it? It's just part of the lifestyle, I said as I walked out. James held Sarah in his arms and tears started to hit the blood-covered floor. Miss Saint smiled and then turned to laugh as she said, You're right, dear. I do love her. The end. Again, that was The Lifestyle, written by Sylvester Barzey. Sylvester is knocking on 30's door and isn't fully sure what he should be doing with his life. He knows what he loves, his family, comics, and writing, yet he can't seem to find someone to pay him to hang out with his family, read comics, and write random shit from time to time, so he's decided to say fuck the world and he's just gonna write, hang out with his amazing family, and read comics even if he has to do it in a box under a bridge. No. That's just his passion talking. He's married. Being homeless for a dream is no longer an option, so if you enjoy this story and want to read some more by Sylvester Barzey, please feel free to go to www.sylvesterbarzey.com. Again, this was another reading with The Bone Collector. Have a chilling night.